Anti-government protests in Iran have entered their 24th day and show no sign of stopping. The National Council of Resistance of Iran, which is an opposition group, claim protests have taken place in over 177 cities and that there have been over 400 casualties. Over the weekend, Iranian state TV was hacked by an anti-regime activists broadcasting message against the supreme leader Ali Khamenei. Now, the unrest was triggered by the death of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old woman who died after being detained by morality police for allegedly breaking the strict law requiring women to cover their hair with a hijab or headscarf. Well, is the Iranian regime threatened by these protests? And could we see real reforms within Iran as a result of all of this? Well, joining me now to discuss this in more detail is Perez Shaktam, who's a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society, which is a foreign policy and a security think tank. Thanks for speaking with me. I think we spoke about a couple of weeks ago. Did you expect that the protests at this point would still be going on?
No. The reason being, such protests have happened in the past and, they usually followed by a very heavy crackdown from the regime and people tend to retreat. But I think this time it's very different. The nature of the protest, the calls for regime change are not call for reforms anymore. And I think this is what is different about this movement. And I think it's about time we start calling it a revolution. When you see just how much it cuts across, ethnic lines, religious line, the fact that it's not about the economy, it's not about, again, call for reforms. It's about regime change, democracy. People want their freedom. And we're talking basic human rights here. Yeah. The ability to formulate a thought, the ability for women to have free movement, and again, to choose the fashion of their clothing, which is very basic. And something that the regime is preventing them from exceeding.
So can you explain that? Because as I mentioned there, Mahsa Amini did die. She was in police custody. She was reported for allegedly, showing her hair when she wasn't supposed to. The morality police arrested her. This will be alien to so many people. They'll be saying, wait, how can something which seems so innocuous, so innocent, be causing all these deaths, be causing all these protests? Can you just explain to us the symbolic significance of something like the headscarf and why the morality police are so intent on policing it?
Right. Well, under Islamic law, a woman is actually mandated to cover her hair, but it's something that is meant to be a very personal choice, a religious choice. Most women across the Middle East choose not to, some choose to. So there's variance of, what a headscarf means. Now, when the Islamic Revolution happened in 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini very early on, it was in 1981, wanted to ensure that women would follow his strict abidance to Islamic law. And that meant not just a headscarf, but the chador. So it means that you cannot even show one strand of hair. It would be an offense to God. And potentially, you could potentially be accused of waging a war against God, which is the death penalty. But if not, just for showing hair, you could receive corporal punishment, 72 lashes, imprisonment, fines. It all depends on the morality police decision. And this is something which over the years has been more or less enforced due to protests and people wanting to have a bit more freedom. But under President Raisi, he decided to abide by the law very strictly. And that meant that women like Mahsa Amini, were approached by police, were severely beaten up, and she died, unfortunately. She's not the only one to have died. But I think it was such a flashpoint moment for Iranian society that they just realized that this regime wasn't going to listen to them, wasn't going to give them the reform that they want. And I think that what you see in the street is, a generational gap in terms of the protests are being led by what they call the Zoomers in Iran, which is basically between 19 and 25 years old, who do not abide by, those Islamic traditions that maybe their parents or grandparents, held. Yeah. And they are aware of the world's social media.
Yeah. They want their freedoms that they see lots of people enjoying. And just very finally, what, if any, is the role of the West in all of this? Because on one hand, I can understand people no longer having an appetite to, getting involved in the affairs of foreign nations. That hasn't necessarily worked very well in the past and has led to more bloodshed. But on the other hand, shouldn't we as the West be supporting people when they are fighting for these basic freedoms?
That's a very good question, actually. Yes. I mean, when we talk about regime change or supporting a revolution, people tend to be a bit wary. It hasn't worked out in the past. Now, what Iranians are asking for is not regime change by means of us doing it for them. It's really just, international support, a recognition that the movement is actually a legitimate popular movement against the Islamic regime. And I think there's a great deal we could do. We could start putting a pin in the JCPOA, for example, and understand that us negotiating with the regime, which is willing to kill its own people, including children, in the streets, on live television, without so much of a remorse, we need to ask ourselves, do we want to deal with those, this regime, those government officials, when they have lost all legitimacy? The answer should be no. We should also abide by our own rules and remember that we did sign the Declaration of Human Rights. And so that means that we have to speak up when human rights are violated so heinously. And I think that, again, we could force the regime's outposts to be closed down. They have charities in the UK which operate as outposts of ISGC and the regime. That should be looked into. We should stop the negotiation with the JCPOA. We should support the people in Iran very publicly and maybe call for their diplomats to be sent back home because they have lost all legitimacy.
And I noticed when you were speaking there, Annalena Baerbock, who is from Germany, she's a foreign minister, Germany's foreign minister. She said that she would ensure the European Union froze assets and impose entry bans. She says those who are beating up women and girls on the street are standing on the wrong side of history. They're expected to decide on sanctions, EU foreign ministers, on the 17th of October. Is this, I'm assuming you welcome these moves, but
Absolutely.
Is this enough, or do you think actually it's just talk at this point?
Well, until it's actually done, it is just talk. But I think that if, the EU, for example, and the UK and the US, had some kind of a cohesive movement here in terms of, public, admonition against the regime, rejecting the violence and actually acting upon it by calling the regime accountable, forcing them to answer to their crimes. And should they refuse, you could very simply tell them that they have to leave and actually engage with parties of the opposition so that, Iranians feel that they are being represented, that their cries are being heard. Millions of people stand to die brutally by the regime because they are shooting live bullets. Because the internet is down, it's very difficult, for us to get any live footage. But there was a massacre in Zahedan just a week ago where 67 people died, including children, and 300 were injured. The regime decided to shoot on, unarmed protesters. Those scenes should not be happening in the 21st century. We should not be negotiating with people who are condemning and actually allowing those violence to take place.
Well,